Now, to introduce this concept of metacognition, let's use an example of a learning task that I faced recently. You see, at the beginning of each semester, I need to learn my students' names, whether it's a face-to-face class or an online class. And what do I know about myself? Well, I know that I tend to struggle to learn the names of my students, particularly my female students. I know that I do better at memorizing through repetition, coming up with mnemonics, making silly wordplay connections between pieces of information. So this semester, I developed a plan to get the class roll and seating chart solidified as early as possible. Then I would use that seating chart to repeatedly look at the students, glance down at the seating chart to review their names, while also thinking of different types of mnemonics and silly connections. For example, I've got a student named Haley who sits by the door. Well, I have a cousin named Haley who's been in some trouble with the law and is always on the run. So in class, I look at the student by the door, glance at the seating chart, see her name's Haley, and then remind myself of my cousin Haley, who always seems to be on the run, or in this case, running out the door. So after doing this with different students, I test myself by trying to glance at random students without looking at the roll. I try to identify which students' names I've mastered, as well as those that I have yet to master, and then go back and review those again and again. So by the end of the first day, I was feeling like the system worked. But by the next class, I seem to have forgotten a number of students' names. I'm also feeling like the connections that I make that are both funny and visual seem to work better than other associations. And yes, I feel better about knowing my students' names, but I also feel a little bit awkward and uncomfortable due to some of these silly connections that pop into my head when one of my students speak. So when Haley raises her hand, yes, I'm remembering her name Haley, but I'm associating her with someone who's been in trouble with the law. So this example is just a way to introduce the key components of metacognition. There's knowledge of cognition. And for learners, this includes knowledge about oneself as a learner, their knowledge of learning strategies, as well as why and when to use a particular strategy. The second component is regulation of cognition. This includes our ability to plan, to monitor, regulate, and evaluate our learning. And finally, there is this element of metacognitive experience. Phrased another way, it includes our feelings, estimates, or judgments related to the features of a learning task, of our cognitive processing as it takes place, and or the outcome. This is what we need to keep in mind when working with students to develop metacognition, helping them to develop knowledge of cognition, in other words, knowledge of themselves, their learning strategies, why and when to use a particular strategy, working with them to develop the ability to create and utilize a plan. For example, in this case, the student's trying to remember this number sequence. We can teach to our students a strategy such as chunking, in other words, breaking up something into smaller chunks to make it easier to remember, as well as working with them to identify and evaluate metacognitive experiences, their feelings, estimates, or judgments of how a particular task worked or is working. We as teachers do this by incorporating strategies that help our students to develop their self-regulatory skills, use of strategies, and ability to think about things metacognitively. Right now, I'd like us to start off by looking at this. Which, if any, of these skills do you use? If you could look at 1 through 6 and identify which, if any, of these skills or strategies do you use. All of these, ladies and gentlemen, have something in common. They are all examples of metacognitive skills that are regularly used by successful learners. Now, successful learners typically use metacognitive strategies such as these, not necessarily limited to these, whenever they learn. But we may fail to use the best strategy for each type of learning situation. That's why our goal is to work with our students to develop metacognition. Now, here are our essential questions. How can we help our students who are stuck get unstuck? And then how can we help students recognize when they need to make some small adjustments in their learning and know what adjustments they need to make? So for this topic, here are our learning objectives. We want to be able to develop and demonstrate an understanding of metacognition and metacognitive strategies. We also want to be able to identify and articulate different metacognitive practices and strategies that are likely to help the students that we anticipate working with. Okay, so let's start by defining metacognition. Metacognition involves thinking about one's thinking or cognition with the goal of enhancing learning. So when we start thinking, not so much, what am I learning about? And instead start thinking, how am I doing in this learning process? That is when we are focusing on our cognition with the goal of enhancing our learning. Metacognition, therefore, involves being knowledgeable about and in control of one's cognitive abilities. Okay? Now, we'll often hear different terms used synonymously with metacognition. Individuals might call it executive function or higher order thinking. It's sometimes referred to as self-regulation or self-directed learning or even mindfulness. All of these are synonymous in some way with what we're talking about, metacognition. In the scriptures, we see this pattern where individuals are asked to let us search and try our ways, or to examine yourselves, prove your own selves. Or on occasions, individuals ask the Savior, what lack I yet? So this process of being aware of where we are right now, how can we improve, what adjustments do we need to make in order to do better, seems to be built into the pattern of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, when we work with our students to develop metacognition, we need to keep this in mind. Metacognitive knowledge includes knowledge about oneself as a learner and the factors that impact our performance. This could be knowledge about strategies, as well as being knowledgeable about when and why to use different strategies. Let's take, for example, a student in the classroom who is there but just really going through the motions, doing school. A student who's saying to himself, yep, I'm taking notes, doing what it looks like the people around me are doing. I'm here doing school. Then you have another student who's much more metacognitive. He or she is asking, what am I not quite understanding right now, and what can I do about it? What can I do if I get stuck on a problem? This is the metacognitive approach that we desire for our students. After a task, some of our students might ask themselves, why didn't I do well on that assignment? I worked so hard on that. And they have this level of frustration. A more metacognitive student would ask questions such as these. What specific questions did I get wrong? Why did I get them wrong? How can I ensure that I'm receiving useful and specific feedback from my teacher to help me progress and do better next time? So as a teacher, we might be wondering, what is my role in helping students develop metacognition? There are at least 3 elements of our instruction that we need to be mindful of when it comes to helping our students be grounded in metacognition. First, let's make sure that we're giving students license to identify confusions within the classroom culture. And we can do this through activities such as asking students what they find confusing, acknowledging those difficulties. Before students begin a task, have them turn and explain the directions to each other, and then identify which part are you most confused about at this point. Have a session where students can share those challenges out, and then we acknowledge those difficulties that they're experiencing. After work is completed, we can integrate reflection into classwork. Short reflection, an oral, written, or discussion form that asks our students what they found challenging or what questions arose during a learning activity, an assignment, an exam, or a project. By far, one of the most important things that we can do in the classroom is metacognitive modeling. In other words, we're going to model the thinking process that goes on inside of our brain in addition to modeling how to complete a learning task. For example, I might have a math problem on the board and be modeling how to complete that problem, but also bringing to the surface the types of questions I'm asking in my head. I might even say out loud. So at this part of the problem, at the very beginning, I'm wondering, how do I start? Oh, I remember we talked about starting in this way. I get into it later on and I say, okay, now what's the next step? So what's going on in our head needs to be brought to the surface so our students can see us modeling these metacognitive questions and processes that help us solve challenging problems. Now, we might be asking ourselves, is this really my job? This isn't exactly what I went into teaching to do, is to teach metacognition. But what we find is, repeatedly, when students come out of high school and begin college or go right into their workforce, they often come with very little metacognitive knowledge, very little knowledge about different strategies, different cognitive tasks, and particularly, they have limited accurate knowledge about themselves and their abilities. In contrast, students who succeed academically have learned to think effectively, independently, and metacognitively. And as you watch these students, you'll see that they tend to employ fundamental skills such as keeping their workspace organized, completing tasks on schedule, making a plan for their learning, recognizing, oh, do I need to change course in order to be more successful? And then when I do make changes and adjustments, monitoring to make sure that these adjustments are actually improving my performance. Now, currently, research shows that metacognitive and cognitive abilities aren't naturally endowed, but can and should be taught and learned. That means for us as teachers, we need to make sure there is explicit instruction alongside of our core subject lessons that help our students develop their abilities to become self-directed learners, and so that they can better improve their own academic performance. So it's not something that students will just pick up. Metacognition needs to be taught explicitly alongside of our content area. So, for example, let's take a look at this. A kindergarten teacher commented that teaching his students to think about their thinking has helped them, his students, to regulate their behavior and choices. He says, teaching them how to think about multiple ways to solve problems has helped my students become more focused, calmer, problem solve more, and better at working out things between themselves versus needing to get the teacher involved all the time. This way of teaching, he believes, helps students with behavior management and has resulted in a better classroom climate where students have more respect for one another, work in harmony more, and work things out more than putting it back on the teacher. So for example, let's look at one of these strategies that we can incorporate immediately. This is thinking aloud. So we are the lead learners in our classroom. Therefore, we can make the concept of metacognition more concrete by demonstrating it in action regardless of our subject or our lesson. So by thinking aloud about the meaning of unfamiliar words and correcting deliberate mistakes in math calculations, we show our students how useful the strategy is and how to think about our thinking, as well as how metacognition can be applied across different contexts, in school and outside the classroom. So these think alouds convey the message to students that everyone, even us as the teacher, that we can learn from our mistakes and benefit from thinking about how we learn and how we might improve our learning. So this approach recasts missteps from evidence of failure into opportunities to learn and improve. Instead of, oh, I keep getting it wrong, it's, okay, how do I troubleshoot and address this in a way that will help me move forward? So by thinking aloud and using the vocabulary of metacognition, we start to effectively model these types of metacognitive discourse strategies or talking strategies that students themselves can employ individually or in a small group or in a larger group.
So today, I'm going to do a text-to-world connection, and it's going to be a difficult one, because I'm really going to talk you through how I think about this connection. So try thinking along with this to yourselves while I think about it out loud. Think aloud is an activity that has two purposes. One, so children can hear a fluent reader. She made 19 trips back into the South. Two, so that they can learn how to critically think through literature.
Clarissa Grimes, a fourth grade teacher at Citizens Academy in Cleveland, Ohio, models the Think Aloud strategy, a key to increasing critical thinking and reading comprehension.
It makes basically just everything so much easier.
Good reading strategies also include
predicting outcomes, cause and effect, analyzing character and plot setting,
and text-to-world connections.
How it Think Aloud works is you spend 15 minutes to read. I was too deeply moved by his words to clap. You stop at appropriate points. So I'm a pretty good reader. At the end, you perform the skill out loud. There was a part in there that confused me. So try thinking along with this to yourselves while I think about it out loud.
Thinking through new material requires connecting to the student's known world.
Connections help you understand people's motivations and how those feelings affect the actions they take. And today, the reading selection I'm doing is a nonfiction comment article on the Gettysburg Address that Abraham Lincoln gave at the end of the Civil War.
Clarissa begins by walking students through the steps of a text-to-world connection.
First, text contains something that activates your background knowledge.
Is Libya a country?
It is. Oh, so I'm going to give you a little background knowledge, okay? And the rebels who think that they are not being treated fairly. Second, you compare the situation in the book to a situation that is occurring in the world. I'm going to be connecting one section, just one section, that's hard for me to understand as a reader in this article to what I've seen on the news in Libya.
It's now that she reads a short text.
When Lincoln was done, there was hardly any applause.
Then she begins the think aloud process.
The Gettysburg Address is considered to be one of the greatest speeches in history, but no one clapped after he gave it. That confuses me. How many of you were slightly confused by that? Be honest. Yeah. As a good reader, I'm going to think about what I've seen of the civil wars that are going on right now in the world. So I know that I can compare situations today to situations that happened long ago. And the thing that makes you mad now are the same things that are going to make people mad in 200 years, right? Comparing helps me understand this text.
Whatever we don't understand, she kind of walks us through it.
The final step of the text-to-world skill is connecting actions to feelings.
And I see clips of people in Libya. I make you watch the news, then I watch it. And you see the anger, but then there's always the sadness left over. Because even though they have different opinions, they're all still Libyans. I'm going to connect that to these people listening to this Gettysburg Address on this battlefield. They, like these Libyans, are thinking about all those who died on that field. What I read in this text was an expression of sadness, just like what I saw on the TV was an expression of sadness. So that's my connection.
It's cool to hear her opinion. I match up what she's thinking and what I think. It makes it easy for us because she'll do it herself and then she'll tell us to do it.
I cannot stress this enough. The most important part is how it helps you understand what you read. Critical analysis of both the text they're reading and the world in which they exist. That's how you want them thinking.
Her reading has come a long way with the help of Ms. Grimes. She's taught her different techniques. When I look at the fluency reports, her numbers have skyrocketed.
Ms. Grimes is the greatest teacher ever. She gives us different strategies to make our reading and writing better.
To do a think aloud well,
1, do it quick. Make it skill focused. Have the steps on the board behind you. Do it exactly the way you want them to be able to perform the skill once they are proficient at it. Teach them how to think through doing this act so that when they go to do it, they already have the thinking through it part down.
So let's take a look at a few strategies that will help us foster metacognitive skills in our students. One strategy is to provide instruction to our students about metacognition and the learning brain. So we could and should introduce this concept of brain plasticity. We could start with a question and discussion, something like, okay, who can share an example of something that used to be difficult for you to do, but now has become much easier now that you've practiced it? So students might share out reading, riding a bike, playing a musical instrument, speaking a different language, something in their sport. Then we explain that as students learn and practice new skills, their brains actually change. For example, reading is much easier now because their brains recognize the words they've learned and stored into long-term memory. Their brains also have stored strategies for figuring out unfamiliar words based on the context. And the same is also true for physical skills. Parts of our brain that control large, small motor skills, these have learned how to play musical pieces on an instrument or dribble a basketball. So these skills become much more automatic. Our brains do change as we develop these skills. Then we share with students that just because we don't know something or aren't good at it right now doesn't mean that we can't learn it and get better. Letting them know that our brains are actually malleable. In other words, they can change, evolve, and improve over time. So just as students learn these other skills they're familiar with, they also have to learn to deal with a great deal of practice and coaching so that they can learn how to be successful academically. Another strategy is to provide instruction to students on goal setting and planning for learning. And here are some steps for that. We start by helping our students establish clear intent, how to formulate positive, motivating goals that are ambitious but really achievable. Then we want them to be very specific, or as specific as possible, in describing what is the outcome that they're aiming to achieve, and start to envision what are the benefits of reaching this goal. Step 2 is to develop actually a detailed action plan for how to progress towards that goal. It needs to focus on when and then planning to help make these steps more concrete. Step 3 is to help our students focus on executing the action steps in their plan. So this might be on day 1, I'm going to do this. Day 2, I'm going to do this. Step 4 is to build in time to help students assess, monitor, and adjust whatever their thoughts are, their actions, as they go through those steps to execute the plan, whether it's in a single class period or over an extended amount of time. We need to help our students understand that we're aiming for steady gains in a positive direction, not necessarily perfection, and that we're always on the hunt for ways to improve the process itself. Though you and I, as more capable learners, probably are familiar with some version of and utilize some version of this process, it needs to be taught explicitly to students. They also need opportunities to practice. Now, why does this strategy matter? Well, the reality is that in order to achieve students' learning goals, they have to learn to identify what their goals are and develop and execute a plan to accomplish them. They also need to be taught to establish their learning goals and develop a plan working towards those in order to become what we call self-directed learners, and in order to equip them with valuable and versatile skills for success in school and beyond. This is what the real world requires, so why not make our classroom like the real world? In addition, the process of learning to establish goals has been found to have an extremely important role of structuring what we call higher mental processes, and that is ultimately what helps to characterize our human intelligence. So by teaching this process to students, we're helping them develop their intelligence as well as crucial elements of metacognition. A third strategy is this: introducing our students to what we call practical optimism. So here we have an individual who's stranded. Even the guitar that he's playing right here has a broken string. So what does he do? He utilizes whatever tools he has in the situation to move forward. This type of practical optimism is what we want to foster in our students. So how do we introduce our students to practical optimism? Well, here's some things to consider. We want to explain that how students think about their learning actually affects their chances for success. If students believe they can succeed through hard work and practice, they will be more likely to do so. For example, let's say that in the last minutes of a basketball game, I am the player who's sitting at the free throw line having to make the last free throw in order to win the game. Now, if I've never practiced or worked hard at that, and I don't believe I can make that, I'm very unlikely to do that. However, if I have worked hard, practiced, and in those moments thought, I can do this, I am more likely to attain academic success. So it's not just blind optimism. What we're trying to foster in our students is this belief that through hard work and practice, they can become more successful. We also want to emphasize to our students that they can adopt a more positive mindset about the ability to achieve their own goals. So we can point out to them that people with more positive outlooks, that they actually perform better in school and at work. They tend to have better relationships with family and friends, enjoy better health. So we want to share the definition of practical optimism, but also underscore that a positive outlook has to be combined with action to achieve those goals. When it comes to practical optimism, it also helps to seek opportunities to inject fun into our classrooms. So when students are playing games or reading aloud a funny story that supports the lesson, that makes learning engaging and memorable, and it actually enhances a positive classroom environment. Another way to help students develop metacognitive skills is to focus on these two areas. We could focus on knowledge about cognition as well as regulation of cognition. So we can help our students understand these key elements. For example, when it comes to declarative knowledge, we can help our students develop a broader knowledge base of their skills, intellectual resources, and abilities as a learner. When it comes to procedural knowledge, we can help our students know the process as well as when are the appropriate contexts in order to apply a process. We can also focus on conditional knowledge, or providing students with opportunities to practice, determining what circumstances something that they've already learned can be transferred to. In addition to knowledge about cognition, we can help our students develop the ability to regulate cognition, whether it's planning, information management, monitoring our own comprehension, debugging strategies, in other words, strategies to correct performance errors or when we're struggling to comprehend. We can also help them develop evaluation skills, or analyzing to what degree is the strategy I'm using being effective to help me reach my learning goals. Now, as a jumping off point, you've been provided through this course metacognitive strategies by grade level. So if we open this up, what we have is a menu of different metacognitive strategies that are used at early childhood level, at the elementary education level, in secondary education, as well as some strategies to help teachers improve their own use of metacognition. The goal should be to identify the metacognitive skills that our students are lacking and provide explicit instruction and practice in a variety of strategies to help them become more autonomous, independent, and metacognitive learners.